all, as perhaps most of the participants have noticed that Taiwan is the first Asian country to enact Domestic Violence Prevention Act in 1998. It's been 3 decades. We have actually developed a very complete prevention network with social services, not only to domestic violence survivors, but also we've provided social services as well as treatment programs to domestic violence perpetrators. So we're still progressing and evolving. All the services are evolving along with social welfare policy as well. And adding to that, a few years ago, 2019, Taiwan was the first Asian country to legalize same-sex marriages. And that's where this multiple discrimination and gender-based violence prevention center begins. I think the country actually recognized the rights of same-sex couples. That means domestic violence or intimate partner violence occurring between couples, same-sex couples, are something that are an issue that we would address in our social welfare policy as well and social services. Anything to add on this part, Huijun?
Thank you for Pei Ru. I think you have introduced the context that we develop our service, because actually our center started in 2019. In the same year, Taiwan has legalized the same-sex marriage.
And I think because one of my research interests is in the anti-gender movement in Taiwan. So I've been really researching quite a lot about the process of legalizing same-sex marriages. And it's quite pioneering for your center to start this early, right, in 2019. Are there any particular reasons why the Garden of Hope Foundation really wanted to establish this center?
At the beginning, some trans women seek help to our foundation, and our foundation realized that there is no enough social services for LGBT group. So we started our center in 2019.
Was that really difficult because it was like the first center or the first social service program for LGBTQ communities?
It's really difficult. At the beginning, the program is funded by the foundation only, and later we started to apply for some subsidies from the government, funding from the government.
Okay, we'll address that later on, but this is just to give everyone, participants, about the context in Taiwan, why the center is important, and in which kind of context are we going to locate this center, because they've provided a very, very unique services to LGBTQ communities.
From the slide, you can see the full name of our center. And our center was established in 2019 by the Garden of Hope Foundation. Yes, just as you mentioned, it's the first one gender-based violence prevention center specializing in LGBTQ affirmative services. We are actually a very small section in the foundation with 1 supervisor and 3 social workers.
And I think one of the special things about your center, especially about the workers, are that all of you come from very different backgrounds, not just from social work, right?
Right. Our supervisor majored in life and death studies at undergraduate level, and she is doing her master's degree in gender studies. And social workers come from the field of social worker, sociology, foreign language and literature, education, and so on.
Well, actually, Huijun and I came to the same university when we did the first degree. Okay, but I'm really interested in something like how would gender studies background kind of contribute to the services in your center?
Because in the traditional training of social workers, the gender courses is not very enough. I mean, there's no gender studies in the training course of social workers. So when we know more about gender theories, we can have a perspective that's realize the importance of gender and the power relations.
Oh, so the power relation things, we're going to talk about that later on, right? And I think that the gender perspective on social services are very important, which is one of the core values of our collaboration and all the training courses and the handbook we developed together. Okay, you can move on.
Okay, some people might be interested in the source of funding. About half of our funding comes from the government and the other half comes from the foundation. And we offer social services to LGBTQ survivors of gender-based violence. Our clients, nearly half of them come to seek help by themselves. And about 30% of them were referred from local governments or other NGOs. And the other 20% of them were introduced to us by their family members or friends.
And this looks very different from other IPV social services programs, right? Why is it special? Like, you've only got half of your funding from the government, and I think more than half of your clients are referred, well, they seek help by themselves, or their family or friends seek help for them. So why is this statistics so unique and important in Taiwanese context?
Yes, most IPV service program, their funding is almost 100% come from the government, and they can serve only the case referred by the government. So for the center, our center have a larger space or freedom. We can use our funding in the programs we think are important, and we can take clients who seek help by themselves.
Okay, I guess there are some participants from other countries who might not be familiar with domestic violence services in Taiwan. So I would like to ask further questions here, as that what about like a program, a survivor service program that is 100% supported by the government? What if a survivor seek help for themselves? What would happen then?
For example, if a survivor lives in, say, Taipei City, and maybe the survivor wants to be served by the Garden of Hope, and if she phoned us by herself, we can only take this case if the Taipei government outsources the service to us, to the Garden of Hope. If we don't cooperate with local government in Taipei City, then we cannot take the case.
Yeah, as far as I know, if any survivors who seek help to any NGO they prefer, I think the workers would refer them back to the government, right?
Right.
And why is that so?
Why is that? Because every local government has funding for the citizens in their city. So if the citizens doesn't live in the boundary of their duty, then they would think that the business of the other local government.
Okay, and this is perhaps one of the problems. There is a disjunctions there, and we will talk about that disjunctions later on. And I think there's another thing is that I keep mentioning that the statistics here is very unique and special is because that most of the domestic violence or sexual violence survivors, when they seek help, when they actually phoned an NGO that provides this kind of services, I think the first thing workers should do, legally bounded to do, is to refer them back to the government because they have to phone 113. We've got a hotline there, or like we have electronic system online that workers could fill in all the information of the survivors. So basically the systematic, there's a system that requires all workers to refer the cases back to the government, and the government would assign the cases to the appointed service program, perhaps from the NGO or perhaps just within the Department of Social Services in the local government. Okay, you can move on.
Okay, and we think it's important to do advocacy work. So when we learn from our casework that the rights of same-sex couples or adults who were abused in childhood were not well protected by the Domestic Violence Prevention Act, we work with legislators to amend the act. And this year we also successfully amend the Sexual Harassment Prevention Act during the Taiwanese Me Too movement in Taiwan.
Okay, so I think there are two achievements that you listed on the slide. So are they all completed in this year?
Yes, during this year.
So you did quite a lot of work then?
Actually, we worked on these two issues for several years.
And how could you tell us more about perhaps the fun part or anything that during the advocacy work, because most of the service programs, survivor service program in Taiwan are just doing the case, right? Case management, case work. So why do you think it's important to do the advocacy work?
Because if we don't amend the act, then there is no system protection. For example, why we started to advocate for the same-sex couples, because one of our cases, she was married to her wife, and her wife's parents abused her. And if it's heterosexual marriage, then it's protected by the law. However, because the lesbian couple didn't live with their parents, so they are not considered as family members. So the abuse was not protected. I mean, we need to amend the act so that the survivors could apply for, how do we say, the
restraining order?
Yes.
Okay. So basically, I think it's important that on the first part of the advocacy work here, the amendment of the Domestic Violence Prevention Act, actually there's a context here because although Taiwan legalized same-sex marriages, but it's very special that it's not written in the civil law. It's another special law. So in that special law about same-sex couples, the family members of same-sex couples are not included. So it's like if I got married with Hui Jun, we are forming a same-sex marriages. That means her mother has nothing to do with me, and if we don't live together, but her mother keep insulting me or keep harassing me or even stalking me, there's like nothing I could do. It's not protected by the Domestic Violence Prevention Act. So that's why I think it's important for the center to advocate for the amendment, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And what about the second part, the Sexual Harassment Prevention Act?
Before the law amendment, there's no social services for the survivors of sexual harassment. So we think it's important for the government to offer funding and resources for the survivors to receive services from social workers or counselors, etc.
Okay, so in Taiwan, we've got different laws to regulate gender-based violences, and in Sexual Harassment Prevention Act, it was enacted earlier, quite early, but in the law, we didn't really say that, well, you could provide survivors services, so that's your efforts, right?
Yes.
Okay, so from here, I think it's from this year? Or from next year?
It's amended this year, and some part of the act will be implemented next year.
Okay. So I could say that in Taiwan, any survivors of sexual violence, sexual assault, sexual harassment, domestic violence, intimate partner violence, all the survivors are having social services delivered, perhaps from the government or from NGOs now, right?
Yes.
Okay.
And we think publication is important method of advocacy work because some social workers or other professionals do not know much about LGBTQ survivors or gender-based violence. So we publish a handbook to share with the professionals our professional experiences.
How do you find about the publication? How is that useful or applicable to your services?
In the handbook, we wrote about the life stories of our clients and how we offer services to them, and also how we see these clients. For example, we use the intersectionality theory. After we publish our experiences, many other NGOs invite us to share our experience with them face to face. So I think publication is also a method of networking.
And education, I think.
Yes. Next slide. It shows the covers of our two handbooks. On the left-hand side of slide, it's the handbook we published last year. And on the right-hand side, it's the second handbook. It's an extension of the first handbook. We extend one of the stories written last year.
Can you kind of like give us some spoiler, just like give us a hint what this new book is about?
Because this year there's Me Too movement in Taiwan, and coincidentally we started to write this handbook on sexual harassment of LGBTQ people before the Me Too movement. So
it kind of linked together, coincidentally.
Yes.
Yeah.
And may I say a little more? It's a trans man experienced sexual harassment in his workplace.
You mentioned about trans man, but obviously from this slide, the cover of the book doesn't look like a man. So are there any hidden secrets or something that you don't want to tell us?
Of course, because when the trans man grew up, his mother enforced him to dress as a princess. So he felt like he's like a doll of the mother.
Okay, so this is like the cover, the image on the cover is actually reflecting this trans man's growing up process.
Yes.
And all his situations.
Yes.
Okay, are you going to translate that into English for everyone to read?
I hope there's funding from the government.
Okay. Let's expect this. Okay, so we will talk about these 6 points now. The first one is that we kind of talk about the ideological practices of the GBV services that really centered on heterosexual women. We talk about the intimate partner violence. And now we want to talk about a recent shift of the ideology within the social services departments. So in recent years, the Taiwanese government are talking about social services that should centered on family. What does that mean? Like family-oriented services. What exactly does that mean?
Actually, I think it means different things for the government and our clients. Yeah. For example, one day a married woman called us for help. She asked help for her family, and she thinks her mother, her sister, and herself is a family. But the government social worker thinks there are 3 families because her mother, her sister, and her and she get married, and they had 3 nuclear families. So the government thinks there are 3 families, but from her point of view, they are a family.
So there's this kind of like disjuncture between the client's personal or subjective view of interpretation of family and how the government define family.
Yes, especially when her mother, her sister, and she lives in 3 different districts. And we talk about how the government divided regions to different areas, and they might live in different areas which is served by different NGOs.
So actually that means when the government defined your client as having 3 family issues, they would assign 3 social workers from NGO or perhaps from local government anyway. They will have 3 social workers to serve them, to deliver services. And how would the clients feel when she actually heard about this? Like, you have 3 families.
We feel it's very strange because she thinks they are a family, and there should be 1 social worker to help them because the issues are interrelated. She and her sister grew up in the same family. That their issues are related to their mother. So how could we separate them to different districts and 3 different NGOs?
Yeah, but they live in the same city, right?
Yes.
Well, if they live in different cities, things would be much more complicated. Okay, anyway, so this is one example, and I think you're going to talk about how LGBTQ communities might define family really differently from the government or perhaps from heterosexual people.
Yes, because most of our clients, their family of origin might not respect or accept their sexuality, their gender expression, or gender identity. So there might be some forms of domestic violence from their parents or their family members, such as psychological abuse, physical abuse, and in some extreme cases, even sexual abuse, which is attempted to change their gender identity or sexual orientation. So for these LGBTQ clients, the family of origin is a cause of trauma or stress, and they might want to escape from their family of origin. For our clients, it's their chosen family, which really matters to them. And even the wider LGBTQ community, which they feel belong to, they feel identified with, or they feel really at home. That really matters when we work with LGBTQ clients.
So can you elaborate more on the chosen family part? Because I think the whole policy about, not just about domestic violence prevention, it's just the social services in Taiwan emphasize a lot on kinship-based family. Oh, I think I just came up, there's an example just came up. The way we define poverty in Taiwan is using household as a unit. Like if you have I think there are some LGBT clients who have rich parents, but their parents just don't want them to live with them, or like they just say, okay, if you don't correct yourself, I'm not going to support you. So they can't even apply for any services, right? Because they have rich family.
That's true, because when the government calculate income, they calculate a whole kinship-based families property. So our clients, even they are kicked out of home by their family, when they want to apply for some services or resources from the government will invest the whole family's resources.
And found out they are rich. Well, it's just their parents are rich, or their sisters or brothers are rich, but not themselves. Yeah. So the policy is not actually seeing the needs of or the speciality of LGBTQ people. And why is chosen family so important? Why is a community so important for them?
When LGBTQ survivors feel they are excluded by their family, they mentally will feel they have to find a partner or friends, community that they can connect with, they can feel belong to. So for LGBTQ survivors, the chosen partner or the friends they find by themselves are even more important than family of origin when they face some difficulties. For example, when they face violence, whether in workplace or in their relationship, they would talk to their friends rather than their family of origin.
Yeah. Because I think this slide itself is actually very it's a breakthrough, I guess, because in Taiwan, the whole society, the cultural elements is actually really centered around kinship-based family, and it's not just about the nuclear family, it's about more extended, or sometimes very extended family. Yeah. So within this cultural context, I think when we talk about, or when the policymakers are actually thinking, okay, we're going to deliver services centered on family, targeted on using family as a basic unit, this might exclude LGBTQ people, and this might again bring them more harms because they don't want to, or they don't feel fit in within the kinship-based family.
In Taiwan, domestic violence survivors would have the shelter is usually for biological female. And although we in Taiwan we have emergency shelters with 24-hour workers, and if a longer housing services is necessary, then women may transfer to transitional housing. But all the above resources are for biological female. So biological male are excluded from all these resources. So we find
they do have emergency sheltering in hotels for
just maybe 5 years.
5 years?
Sorry, 5 days.
5 days to
5 days.
I think the longest I have heard is like 2 weeks, but that's it, right?
That's it.
Yeah, and it's hotel. It's not.
It's
like
hotel.
a sheltering service. So these currently these services are for women. Does that mean like lesbian survivors could use these services?
Yes, they can use the shelter services.
What about gay men and trans women? Trans men?
No.
No? No. So you're housing these people?
Yes, because we find there's no emergency sheltering for gay men or trans women, trans men. So we persuaded a local government and cooperate with them. Yeah. So they say that they offer the building and
yeah.
Oh, yeah. So we provide transitional housing there.
Are there any gender perspective that you have to be aware of when you provide sheltering services for LGBTQ survivors?
I think space is one of thing that because most of the sheltering is dormitory, all people live together, so the issue is of privacy is not so important in traditional emergency shelter, but we are aware that privacy is really a concern for LGBTQ people. So the housing itself is a studio flat.
And so far in Taiwan there isn't any like transitional housing or long-term supportive housing for LGBTQ people?
No. There's no emergency sheltering and no long-term supportive housing for LGBTQ people.
And how are these people, well, after they leave the housing services, where are they going to go?
They have to rent a house by themselves. But in Taiwan, there is still homophobia and transphobia in general society. So our clients, our LGBTQ clients, are usually discriminated or rejected by landlords.
Or they just explicitly say, no, we're not going to rent this house to like gay, or we're not going to rent this house to trans? Do they say that?
I think there's differences between gay men or trans women. For trans people, when we want to rent a house in Taiwan, we need to show our ID card. And when trans people's ID card, the registered gender is different from their appearance, then the landlord will think it's not your ID card. So I think that's the problem trans people would face. For gay men people, I think it's usually not so obvious. The landlord would think two men rent house together is very strange. The landlord might don't want to rent the house, but usually they wouldn't say that directly.
Yeah, I think when I'm looking for houses to rent, all the landlords have a lot of really private questions to ask, like, where are you going to live with? What is the relationship between you and that person? And a lot of private questions.
Yeah.
They're actually filtering out LGBTQ people during the process.
Yes.
Yeah. So this, I heard that this housing services that you provide is going to close soon?
Yes, because we started the housing services in 2021. So it's 3 years now. During these 3 years, we found it's really difficult for LGBTQ survivors to use this transitional housing for two reasons. Firstly, they have to be reported to the government in order to be entitled to live in government's house.
Oh, because this is an outsourcing service.
Yes.
Is it?
Yes. Yeah. But most LGBTQ survivors don't want to be reported to the government because they would worry whether they would be forced to come out if they are reported to the government. And secondly, because there is no emergency sheltering for LGBTQ people, so it's really difficult for them to live in a transitional housing, because that's for survivors who who are physically safe. They don't have safety issues.
So, from what you said, the center is trying to provide transitional housing, but we're actually lacking the part on emergency sheltering, and we're lacking on the long-term supportive housing here.
Right.
Okay. And I think perhaps the participants would like to know more about how the transitional housing services work. What is your design and stuff like this?
The design, you mean?
I mean, the program. How do you design the program to really house people like lesbian, gay, trans, because they have different gender, biological sex, and different gender identities and sexual orientation. I think for a lot of social workers, they might be concerned with the management problem. Are there any management problems here?
Not really, because the house itself is not. Usually there are two kinds live there at the same time. I mean, it's not full. And also because it's not full, the government think LGBTQ people don't have housing needs.
Oh, so that's another problem, because not like all the rooms are not, well, perhaps just 2 or 3 people live in the house, and the government think, well, there's no need to have housing services for LGBTQ communities.
Yes, they think the house it's not full.
Yeah.
It's not all occupied by our clients, so they think there's no need.
Oh, so one of the biggest problems, management problems, is to manage the government's outsourcing contract then?
Yes.
Okay. I think we're talking about something really specific to Taiwanese context, especially on housing services and survivor services. They are really highly controlled by the government. So I think the autonomy of social workers or even NGOs are kind of compromised here. Yeah, and this is one of the difficulties that we face when we really try to want to provide services, but there are always KPI and things like this that we have to compromise our ideal and reality. Okay, let's move on to the next one. It's talking about non-holistic approach of social welfare policy. We talk about how the whole service programs are designed to be short-term instead of long-term services. The non-holistic approach of social welfare policy, there are so many examples there. So I just want to give the very brief context that if you are reported to be a survivor of gender-based violence, and the government would assign a social worker for that survivor, and if that survivor has other social welfare identities, we would say categories, perhaps poverty, perhaps mental health issues, how would social workers work together, collaborate together, or just not?
Just not.
That's too honest. How does that collaboration work or look like?
For example, one of our lesbian clients, she has issue of, can we see the next slide?
Yep, here.
She is actually labeled as perpetrator in the system because she beat her wife in public. And so when she and her partner was reported to the government social worker thinks she's the perpetrator. The government provides services to her partner, but not her. And when she called us for assistance, we found that she actually was issued disability certificate because of her bipolar disorder. But in Taiwanese system, the issue of violence is the duty of gender-based violence prevention
Protective
work. Yeah, and her disability issue is the duty of Department of Disability Services,
which is like I think we have to kind of stop here because this is so complicated here. Protective social work belongs to the Department of Social Work, and if people who are having disability certificates, the social services they receive are not from social work department. They are from, I think it's health control, more like health control center, right? Kind of different here.
Her bipolar disorder is belongs to
the health department, not the social welfare department. Yeah, that's the complicated part here. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, but can I stop here? You just talk about her being the perpetrator, so you actually provide services to perpetrators as well in this center.
We don't think we are providing services to perpetrator because actually we would question the binary distinction between so-called victim and perpetrator. By the way, I want to say that although the word survivor is internationally used in the field of domestic violence, but the Taiwanese government also still use the word victim.
Yeah.
I think the word itself reveals the assumptions embedded in our policy making. And we don't think a person can be labeled as a victim or a perpetrator because every client has their own life stories. And for example, for the perpetrator we serve, we find her life experience as so-called victim.
During her childhood or?
Childhood and her schooling ages.
Mm-hmm. So that's what you mean by holistic approach, is it?
Yes, because one day this client attacked her classmate because her classmate excluded her, and that reminds her of painful experience of being excluded and bullied. So she attacked them because of her trauma.
Mm.
And we think it's important to know what's underneath her so-called aggressive, violent behavior.
So how can I say that you provide services that's also trauma-informed, and that's important part of your service?
Yes, we won't simply attributing her violent or aggressive behavior to her disability or bipolar disorder.
Mm-hmm. I think a lot of workers might ask this question, like, if we are going to provide trauma-informed practices as well as LGBTQ affirmative practices, how many trainings are we going to have?
Yeah, we need to have a lot of training.
And that's in in your center, you actually provide trauma-informed practices training as well.
Yes, and the foundation also provides resources for our training.
That sounds really good, and I think it's important for. I think we didn't mention that earlier on, but in the handbook, at the very beginning, I think it's in the introduction, we talk about the minority stress model, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and the minority stress model is actually telling us that LGBTQ people, they might suffer from the stressors, social stressors. And the way that if we have this trauma-informed framework to really understand how they react to these social stressors, that might help us to deliver our service more individualized to their needs and to look into their trauma and really help them to recover from multiple discriminations.
Yes, so I think the knowledge about the minority stress model is very essential to LGBTQ affirmative services.
Oh, you think it's essential?
Yes.
So if let's think of in an opposite way. If I'm not aware of the minority stress model,
then a social worker may think clients like this perpetrator is just her own problem.
Or she's just a bad criminal?
Yes. So usually government social worker may think so. But when we are aware that she experienced, she had has to face lots of social stress, social exclusion, discrimination, and even different kinds of violence when she grew up, then we can more understand her and know why she is acting or reacting like this.
Mm-hmm. Are there any service program about LGBTQ perpetrators of IPV in Taiwan?
No. For example, the government also have perpetrator program.
Yeah.
But the perpetrator program, I think they would assume perpetrators are men, biological male. So the social workers in such program may not have enough understanding of LGBTQ people. So they may not know how to work with lesbian perpetrators.
Yeah, that reminds me of my experiences of deliver kind of like a course, a very short-term course to IPV perpetrators, because the policy kind of assumed that all the perpetrators are men. So there's this one time I saw a woman sitting down there, and I was like, okay, because all the courses are designed really targeted at men and masculinity and the aggressive behavior, aggression related to kind of like toxic masculinity. So when you see a woman sitting down there, it was like, okay, I think I have to change my course outline and everything. And a lot of workers providing services for perpetrators, they also talk about this as well. Like, what if there's an LGBTQ perpetrator? What am I going to do? They have no clue what to do.
Because it's not in their training.
So are you thinking that perhaps a holistic approach could help these workers to see LGBTQ perpetrators from a different perspective?
Of course.
In the first session of this workshop, I think we've talked about mandatory reporting duties. I'm not sure if everyone still remember that. That is so important because we've got different laws to regulate social workers, educators, medical staff, police, immigration personnel. These people are regulated by the law that by Domestic Violence Prevention Act, Sexual Assault Crime Prevention Act, the Protection of Children and Youth Welfare and Rights Act, Gender Equity Education Act. These acts all tell us that, for example, me as an educator or social workers in the center, all tells us that once you've spotted or you heard of a suspicious or suspected gender-based violence case, you have to report to the government. We've got 113 hotline, and we've got a website that allows us to do the mandatory reporting duties. So one of the most stressful thing for LGBTQ survivors of sexual and gender-based violence in Taiwan is that once they are reported, they are forced into the system. They are forced into receiving services from social worker, from a lot of different departments. So this is a forced coming out process. They have to deal with the trauma from LGBTQ survivors, have to deal with the traumas from sexual or gender-based violence at the same time when they're forced to receive services, receive social services. They are forced to deal with another stressor. It's a social stressor. They have to deal with the stress of forced to come out during the whole process. So this legal regulation is actually giving us a lot of reflection or when we are designing this course, because ideally speaking, LGBTQ people should not be forced to come out. And the coming out process, they should have their own control about who and when and where to come out. The ones you've encountered this sexual and gender-based violences, you kind of have no choice. You are forced to receive a lot of services and fill in a lot of forms, paperwork, a lot of things, and you're just forced to everyone to provide you services to know about your sexual identity or your gender identity. And the second thing that is foundational in our courses is that we kind of want to address an issue that we discovered or we observed when we are serving LGBTQ survivors, is that some of the policymakers or advocates to advocate for gender equality, they kind of assume that women's rights and LGBTQ rights are mutually exclusive. There's always this saying that we have to deal with women's issue first, and then if we have resources, we will perhaps talk about LGBTQ. This might seem contradictory at first because we've legalized same-sex marriages. Well, theoretically speaking, the society or the government is actually protecting LGBTQ rights, right? But there are some advocates or like some policymakers or even legislators, they still prioritize women's rights over LGBTQ rights. So when we talk about gender equality, it seems that, especially when we talk about gender equality in the system of gender-based violence services, it seems that most of the workers or policymakers are still thinking about women's protection, protecting women from gender-based violences, whereas LGBTQ communities include biological men, include trans men, trans women, whose rights are often undermined in this broad concept of gender equality. Okay, so both of this are the foundation of why we want to develop this LGBTQ affirmative courses and why we think it's really important to address LGBTQ people's everyday life, their everyday life experiences, their experiences of institutional barriers. If we talk more about this, then social workers in Taiwan would know more about LGBTQ people. So the first step is that we use some concepts that are, yes, they are from I would say Western countries or European countries and North American countries who have already developed gender theories for decades. So the first thing is that one of the features of our LGBTQ affirmative social work training courses is that we don't begin our course with introducing the categories of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer. We don't begin the course with these definitions because in Taiwan, myself, I've been sitting in quite a lot of courses on LGBTQ issues, and a lot of the lecturers would begin the course with introducing what L means, what G means, what B means, what T means. L means lesbian, G means gay, B means bisexual. I don't begin the course with these basic terms. There's a very specific reasons why I don't begin with these terms. I begin with the concept, the spectrum of sex, gender, and sexuality. I think it's important that when we talk about sex, gender, and sexuality as a spectrum that helps us, not just social workers, that helps the public to really know about gender diverse communities. People cannot be defined by terms like lesbian, like gay, because we have clients, we have people who having sex with same-sex person, but at the same time, that clients might have a heterosexual marriage. So how do you define this person? If this person insisted on being a heterosexual, would that be helpful for the workers to say, no, you're not a heterosexual, you are a bisexual, or you're actually a gay man? Would that be helpful? I don't think that could be helpful. So sometimes when we begin the course with introducing these categories, workers or the listeners will be limited by this framework. So I don't begin with this. I'd rather choose this genderbread person. It can be downloaded online. Just Google genderbread person. It can be downloaded online. So I'd rather begin with this genderbread person, or some of my friends would begin with gender unicorn. You could also download that really cute unicorn, really colorful and cute unicorn from the web. Okay, so why is the spectrum concept very important? I want to introduce this concept about how we don't assume that people who were born with a female body must identify themselves as women. So this is the first thing that we talk about. If I am born with a female body, I might identify myself as a man or a woman. You don't know. You don't just assume that a person with an ID card saying that that person is a male, and then you just assume that his identity, his or her identity, gender identity is a man. He or she might be a woman. So this is the first thing that I would like all the social workers to really think through and think about. So the spectrum of sex, gender, and sexuality is, I think, the very first step to know about the complicated and sophisticated perspective of LGBTQ people. And the second thing is that we localize the spectrum of sex, gender, and sexuality in Taiwan. So for example, in Taiwan, we might have this everyday conversation. It happens quite often when we were child. I think my friends still talk like this. I'm 40 and my friends still talk like this. If we have a friend's children who's about like 5 years old or 6 years old, some of my friends would just ask that child, like, if that child looks like a boy. Some of my friends would just ask that boy, okay, do you have any girls you like in your class? Like, do you have any female classmates that you like? There is this heterosexual assumption about every person, and it's just in our everyday life. So when I use this spectrum of sex, gender, and sexuality, I want all the participants, the listeners, students and workers to rethink about this everyday conversation. This conversation is problematic because I see a child with male body. This child might identify himself or herself as a woman. And this child, I don't know when he or she becomes a teenager, which sex or gender person would she or he likes. So I don't assume anything. And by using and really practicing to think about gender identity, biological sex, sexual attraction, romantic attraction, and gender expression, by separating them, it's helping us, especially for the workers, it's helping the workers to not to assume any client's gender identity or sex or their sexual orientation. I think this practice is very important, and we actually let the workers to do some little practices in the training course as well. And by introducing the spectrum of sex, gender, and sexuality, we also want to address the cultural norms of sex, gender, and sexuality. I just provided an example, which is kind of like happening in our everyday life, but also there are so many cultural norms around us about sex, gender, and sexuality. And I think during the training courses, we will have some conversation, have some group discussions for the workers to reflect on themselves. I think reflection is very important. When we are delivering LGBTQ affirmative practices, being self-reflexive, workers have to be self-reflective, like they have to think about or being aware about their heterosexual assumptions all the time. They have to be aware about their binary concept about sex and gender all the time. So being reflective and think about the myth or the stereotypes that we ourselves have could help us to work with LGBTQ clients or people more smoothly, because we know that, okay, if I say this word, this sentence in this way, my clients might realize that I'm not that friendly. This worker might not be really inclusive. There are so many terms and so many words that we use in our everyday life that could reflect this heterosexual-centered ideology. We've got a lot of examples in Taiwanese context, but these might not be applicable to different cultural contexts. So I'm not going to give you examples, but perhaps one of the examples I could talk about is that I've noticed that in English-speaking worlds, we would ask people about their pronoun, how they would like to be called, like he, she, they. But in Taiwanese context, because in Mandarin Chinese, we don't have this gendered pronoun there. When we say he or she, it's the same, it sounds the same. So you can't really tell if I'm talking this he or she. If I'm saying ta, you can't really tell I'm talking about a woman or a man. So this cultural differences is important. We have different issues when we are speaking Chinese. For example, it's kind of like, it's very common that when we call someone, for example, a social worker, when this social worker is assigned a case and the social worker is going to make a phone call to his or her client, the first thing I think a lot of people would do this would say, Mr., for example, Chen. Okay, Mr. Chen, is Mr. Chen there? And why would you call this person Mr.? Because you see that on the reporting form, it's a male. So you would just naturally assume that he would like to be called Mr. But this assumption might not be right. So this is a part of the training there. I would also tell the social workers that, well, you don't assume anyone's gender identity when you receive the reporting form. You could just like make a phone call and say, is Tony there? Can I talk to Tony? And you don't assume that Tony's partner is Tony, it's a male name, right? You don't assume Tony's partner is female. So there's this little thing that's very specific to different cultural contexts. And this is the cultural norms here. That's something we'd like to break through at the very beginning, that I would like to deconstruct at the beginning of the courses. And not only do we talk about cultural norms of sex, gender, and sexuality, we are very sensitive about the institutional barriers LGBTQ people face. So we want to, in our training courses, we also collected experiences, like some examples we talked about in the earlier session. We talk about institutional barriers, and we kind of use this the spectrum of sex, gender, and sexuality to examine, to analyze the policy, to discuss those institutional barriers that might let LGBT or might stop LGBTQ people from seeking help, from receiving services, or dropping out of the services. So this spectrum, I find it really useful to not just to guide workers to reflect on themselves. I find it really useful when we address the cultural norms and the cultural norms that's embedded within the institution of gender-based violence prevention programs or service programs. So this is how we localize the gender-bread person and how we address these issues in our training courses. And this will allow the workers and the listeners to think in depth about their own gender experiences, their own sexuality, and as well as to think about their clients' sex, gender, and sexuality. So I think it's not just useful for us to think about LGBTQ people, it's also useful for us to think about heterosexual people, heterosexual men, heterosexual women as well. Okay, so this is the first concepts that we would use to kind of train social workers. And this will lead to a very important concept that we've been talking about quite a lot in this workshop as multiple discriminations. The center is named after this, like the Multiple Discrimination and Gender-Based Violence Prevention Center, right? So why is multiple discriminations this concept? Why is it important? If we have this concept and we like see our clients through the lens of multiple discriminations, if we understand that all the LGBTQ people are experiencing multiple discriminations all through their lives, then we could understand that why they feel rejected or excluded during the services provision. It's quite often that when social workers are providing services to LGBTQ communities, they feel like their clients are testing them, are challenging them. And the workers would feel like it seems that if I'm not LGBTQ person, I am not, I don't have enough knowledge to provide services to my clients. And that kind of challenges and testing from the clients, from the LGBTQ clients, is kind of like a defensive way to prevent themselves from getting hurt, from being excluded again, because they've experienced so many social exclusions, so many rejections throughout their whole life. So this is one of the little things that if we know that LGBTQ people have experienced multiple discriminations throughout their lives, then we have a new perspective to see why they are testing us all the time, why they are challenging us all the time, or why they are undermining our efforts all the time, because they get rejected so often, and we as workers, we might be the next person to reject them or to fail them. So there's this defensive attitude all the time. But this is just the beginning. If you build up enough trust and let the clients know that, okay, we actually know that you've been through a lot. You've been through a lot, and there's so many discriminations in your everyday life. We actually know that, and we want to address these issues with you. We want to work with you on these issues. Then perhaps that relationships could change from a very defensive attitude. The clients might shift from a very defensive attitude to a more accepting or like cooperating attitude. And to understand multiple discriminations could help us to address the mental health issues that a lot of LGBTQ clients might have. I talked about this earlier on, like a lot of LGBTQ clients in the center, they suffer from mental health issues. Almost half of them suffer from mental health issues. So if we have this concept of minority stress model, if we use this model to really look into LGBTQ clients, we might realize that, well, long-term stressors from the society, from the environment could cause a lot of mental health issues. And these are combined with social exclusion. So this multiple discriminations is really something that's important for workers to, when they are delivering practices, they have to address multiple discrimination issues. So we will help the workers, we'll have to train the worker first to identify multiple discriminations in the family life, in school life, in work life, as well as in social life, and to help the workers to really understand trauma through the lens of multiple discriminations. So that it's kind of linked back to what we said earlier on. We talk about the short-term intervention of the GBV services in Taiwan because of the institution. This is the institutional barrier in Taiwan. Like, we only offer short-term interventions, and that kind of stop a lot of workers from really getting the space and time to look into the multiple discriminations their LGBTQ clients might face during their life. So what we do is that in this program, in this training program, and for the workers in the center, in the multiple discrimination center, we spend quite a lot of times talking about mental health issues, which is kind of different from other social workers who are providing protective work services. We spend quite a lot of time to examine and look into how gender identity, sexual identity, the barriers that they face, the barriers that LGBTQ people face might link to their mental health issues, or the correlations, interrelations, interplays of sexual identities and mental health issues, as well as multiple discriminations. This could help the workers to really educate them to know more about the mental health of the LGBTQ communities in a more affirmative way. So when I'm saying that, for example, this center having an extremely high percentage of survivors who are suffering from mental health issues, I am not saying that being gay, being LGBTQ would definitely suffer from mental health problems. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that to understand that their mental health issues, their mental health problems have a deeper root. It's very, very important. It's important for workers to begin this affirmative, to practice in a more affirmative way. So I've talked through about the basic concept, and one of the most important perspective when delivering services, and how we actually address the key concept to train the social workers. I think it's time for us to take a 10 minutes break here. I think the cultural context is important when we are writing that, conceptualizing that book and writing that book. We want to provide local stories. We want to provide LGBTQ people's life experiences that are really close to people's living reality. And I mentioned this is because that a lot of time when I was discussing about LGBT clients with the multiple discrimination center, we've got this feeling that a lot of the survivors, they receive their services, they are from lower classes, they are from working classes. And this is why we came up with this idea to talk about intersectionality. The concept of intersectionality might sound familiar to people from EU countries because in the gender mainstreaming policy in the EU, they apply or they talk quite a lot about intersectionality, and some universities, European universities, they offer courses on gender and intersectionality. It might sound familiar for people who work with EU countries or work within the EU countries, but this is a concept that in Taiwan, this is a concept that is seldom discussed in social work practices. We just began to talk about intersectionality in social work practices, in social policy in the recent years, and it's a bit limited to a very small group, a tiny group of theorists in the academia. So after very long discussions about the LGBTQ clients in the center serves, we decided that, well, perhaps it's time for us to localize the concepts, the theoretical framework of intersectionality in Taiwan, to provide a different perspective, or I would say a more insightful perspective for social workers, for frontline workers really. Because I kept mentioning multiple discriminations faced by LGBTQ people in Taiwan, and I believe it's across the globe. And I haven't mentioned another concept. It's called intersected discriminations. Intersected discriminations is different from multiple discriminations. When we talk about multiple discriminations, we're talking about LGBTQ people who face discriminations, gender-based or sexuality-based discriminations across their life in different life stages at different occasions. But when we talk about intersected discriminations, we are addressing the discriminations that are intersected on a person's different social identities. For example, Huijun provided examples about a lesbian client who suffered from bipolar disorder, and she was discriminated because of her sexuality and her disability status. So this is intersected discriminations. And I want to, in our training courses, we really want to raise this awareness of intersected discriminations, especially this type of discriminations within social service department, within social services in Taiwan. So we spent a lot of time discussing this social identity well. We kind of adapted it and to localize it. And okay, so there are categories that are specific to Taiwanese society. I deliberately put on this social will that is written in traditional Chinese, and I believe that Google Translation is powerful enough that every participant could just use Google Translation and you could understand it broadly. And anyway, I deliberately put on this traditional Chinese version of the social identity will. It's just to let everyone know that we're using this as a tool to educate social workers, to equip them with a framework of intersectionality that is specific to Taiwanese context. For example, Huijun talked about the sexuality, gender identity, and ableism in Taiwan. And myself, what I found really important is the class issue, the class discrimination, which is the purple part in this slide next to the pink part. Because Taiwanese society seldom talk about the income and how the class discriminations could influence clients. What I find it fascinating is that when I offer the social identity will in the training courses, some of the workers would tell me that, well, before this course, they've never thought that they earn that much compared to some of their clients. So they are not really aware of the class differences there. Just based on the economic status. And some of the workers, female workers, would tell me that, well, I just try to, draw out my own social identity well and my husband's social identity well. And now I get it why you keep saying that man as breadwinner is something like really patriarchal, and this is an imbalanced power dynamics within an intimate partner relationships. After using this social identity well, the social workers would think about their social positions within this society and compare this with their clients. And I remember that Hui Jun just shared something that impressed her during our discussion. And something that impressed me during our discussion is the languages part. I am using English now. If you could, the language part is the purple part next to the blue part. You could use Google Translation to see what that means. At the center, the core of the power is the Mandarin Chinese that a lot of people in Taiwan would use. It's the Mandarin Chinese. But the next powerful language is English. And the outer side, those languages that are less powerful is Taiwanese, Hakka, or languages from the Aboriginal people. This is something very special in Taiwan because we value Mandarin Chinese and English more than, we would say, mother tongues of a lot of Taiwanese people. And that creates a kind of language discriminations within the domestic violence social services. For example, I work a lot with perpetrators of domestic violence. I deliver courses to them, and I supervise some perpetrators program. During this collaboration with perpetrators and social workers from the perpetrators programs, we realized that a lot of perpetrators who are not fluent in Mandarin Chinese or English, they are discriminated in the court or during the whole process of social services. They are perpetrators, but they still face this social discriminations or social exclusions simply because they use the languages that are less valued in Taiwan, but these languages are their mother tongues, especially for working class people using Taiwanese, or especially people who are using Taiwanese as their mother tongues. These perpetrators are often undermined, are often discriminated simply because of their working class background and the languages they use. And the Mandarin Chinese is the official language, and when we are delivering services or courses to perpetrators, we are using more difficult languages. Even though it's in Mandarin Chinese, we're using more professional terms and with a lot of technical terms to deliver those courses. And that creates a language barriers for perpetrators who speak Taiwanese, let alone there are some perpetrators or survivors who are speaking Aboriginal languages. There are always this language barriers and language discriminations here. This is very specific in Taiwanese context. So when we are discussing this, when we are discussing how to localize the social identity wills, we have to think about a lot of cultural contexts here, a lot of cultural elements. And to be honest, when I deliver courses like this, and we talk about each categories, which categories have more power in terms of their social positions, there are always people who are holding these more powerful positions. They would oppose to our view. They would say, no, I don't think you're right. I don't think I have much power. But this kind of claim is kind of like dismissing the fact that we are talking about intersected identity. We're not just talking about powerful position, less powerful positions. We're talking about a person, the diversity within a person. We have these intersected categories, and so do our clients. So back to the social identity wells, LGBTQ people, they might be disadvantaged in terms of their gender identity or sexual orientation, but perhaps we could find some advantaged position like their income, their education level. But we oftentimes we found that a lot of LGBTQ survivors who are missed or who are rejected by the system, the services, are people who really have their social identities are always on the outer side of this social identity wheel. They actually embody what we talk about, the intersected discriminations. So this would link back to when we talk about the holistic approach earlier on, because when we see that a person, this is not limited to LGBTQ people, when we see that a client is intersected, his or her identities are intersected, we have more tools and different perspective to see this person beyond violent events, beyond perpetrator or victims categories. And this is what we hope to bring to our social workers in Taiwan. And I hope that with this sharing, participants from different countries could start to think, well, how can we use intersectionality as a tool to educate social workers to provide an insightful perspective to understand our clients. So what I did here is that when we, after we really developed the social identity wheels, to localize the social identity wheels, to talk about the intersected discriminations faced by the LGBTQ people, I would kind of design different activities for social workers to practice how to use this. And I want to share some fun bits of this training courses. So back to this social identity well. There's a social worker who impressed me a lot when I have I talk about the social identity wheel, and we had a short break. During the break, she just came up to me and say, "Oh, now I see why there are so many problems with our social welfare policy." And I was like, oh, I just talk about social identity well, and I didn't talk about any problems about our social welfare policy. So what makes you think that you found the answer for all the problems of social welfare policy? And this social worker, she just told me, you know what? When you were talking about the social identity well, I just kind of draw a social identity well for one of the most influential policy makers in Taiwan. And I realized that, he is a male. He lives in Taipei City. He's got a doctoral degree, and he is a Han people. He speaks fluent Mandarin Chinese, and he's a heterosexual man. And he is healthy in terms of mental conditions and physical conditions. He's got a heterosexual marriage. So he's everything that symbolizes the powerful people of Taiwanese society. And I was like, okay, so how does this finding lead you to, the answer of all the problems of social welfare policy? So this social worker, she just told me, well, apparently he is not quite capable of understanding how people from rural areas or working class men would suffer with low income. He apparently could not really understand why these people suffer and why these people need more services. So this is a very interesting experience when I teach intersectionality. That brings the social worker to really reflect on the policy problems and her own position. She drew a social identity about herself and compared that with the policymaker, and she decided that, well, I could see why my voice, the worker's voice, could never reach to the policy-making process because, I'm not a man, I'm a female, and my income level is not that high, and I don't have a doctoral degree, stuff like that. So this is something that really impressed me, and I find it really useful when we talk about reflexivity. So this social worker, she actually inspired me to design more group activities on reflexivity.